Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of compelling sources, articles, reports, research, sometimes even unexpected things like a Reddit thread, and really pull out the key insights for you, our listener. Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, it affects almost everyone: school funding, resource equity, and the really surprising, sometimes unfair ways that where a child lives, their ZIP code, can shape their whole educational path.
It's definitely a complex area. And our goal today, our mission, is really to give you a shortcut to getting up to speed on it. We've gathered quite a range of sources. We've got reports from the National Center for Youth Law. Their green still follows white report is incredibly insightful.
Absolutely. We're also looking at stuff from the Education Civil Rights Alliance, number analytics on different funding models, some key research from UCLA's Civil Rights Project and Brookings about gentrification.
Right, and the Learning Policy Institute, too. Plus those articles you mentioned about the ZZI code effect from places like EdSurge and the Houston Defender,
Yeah.
they really show how it plays out.
Yeah, and for that, ground level view, we even found this Reddit discussion about busing laws in Ohio. It kind of brings the policy right down to everyday reality.
So our deep dive today, it's all about unpacking these different layers. We'll look at how these historical inequities are still playing out, not just between school districts, but kind of shockingly, within the same district. We'll touch on gentrification, how that adds another twist, and then look at solutions, both the sort of traditional ones and some more innovative ideas for creating genuinely equitable opportunities in education.
Should be eye-opening. Expect some surprising facts and real examples to show both the challenges and maybe some ways forward. Okay, so let's dive right into the core issue, this inequitable funding. When we talk about resource equity in schools, it's more than just equal funding, right? Can you help us sort of define that, especially for people who might just think, well, equal is fair?
Yeah, it's a really important distinction. Resource equity means the fair distribution of resources, both, material stuff and people, teachers, staff, that specifically responds to the individual needs of each kid. So think about it like this. A flat distribution is where every student gets the exact same amount of money. Sounds fair on the surface, maybe.
Yeah, seems logical.
But if you have students who need a lot more support, maybe for disabilities or learning English, or they're dealing with homelessness, just giving them the average amount, well, that's not actually equitable. It doesn't meet their needs. Then you've got regressive spending, which is basically the worst case scenario. The schools serving the kids with the highest needs get the least resources.
The exact opposite of what you'd want.
Exactly. The goal, what we're striving for, ideally, is progressive distribution. That means the schools serving students with the greatest needs actually receive the greatest share of resources to meet those needs.
Yeah, that definitely shifts the thinking away from just equal. So when we look at how schools are actually funded here in the U.S., where does this idea of progressive funding run into problems?
Well, the funding picture is mainly state and local. On average, states chip in about 45.3%, local sources about 44.1%, and the federal government adds a smaller piece, around 10.5%. And here's the kicker, really. Local funding is very often tied directly to local property taxes.
Right, property values.
Exactly. So that immediately builds in disparities between wealthier areas and less wealthy areas. And, scholars talk about this creating an education debt.
Education debt. Explain that a bit.
It's this idea that it stems from a history of, racism and oppression that actively denied educational opportunities to Black, Indigenous, and other students of color for generations. And the effects of that debt, that historical underinvestment, they're still felt today.
And the numbers really back that up, don't they? That EdBuild report from 2016, it found that mostly non-white districts got, $23 billion less than mostly white districts.
Yeah, $23 billion less in just that 1 year. It averaged out to about $2,200 less per student. It's not just a gap. It's, like you said, a systemic underinvestment.
Yeah.
It channels resources away from the students who often need them most.
And it just reinforces those historical disadvantages instead of helping overcome them.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just between districts. These inequities pop up within the same district, too. That's what we call within district inequity, or WDI.
Okay, so inside the same district boundaries.
Right. And these internal gaps often fall along lines of race, disability, poverty, English learner status. There's actually a framework, the Green factors, from an old Supreme Court case, Green v. County School Board, back in '68. They used these factors to see if schools were really desegregating properly. Things like faculty, staff, transport, extracurriculars, buildings.
All the components of a school experience.
Exactly. And recent data, like from the 2018-2019 school year, shows how the actual spending per student lines up or doesn't line up with the demographics of the schools right along those lines.
So when you dig into those specific findings, say from the National Center for Youth Law report, what does it actually look like for different groups? Anything particularly stand out?
Oh, it's quite sobering. For Black students, for instance, almost half, 44.2%, go to schools in districts with regressive spending patterns compared to white students.
Wow, nearly half.
Yeah, meaning their schools often get around 10% less funding on average. And, while there's variation, some Black students are in progressive districts, the overall trend is concerning. Latin students also very frequently experience this regressive spending pattern. It seems to hit them most often compared to other racial groups in the data we looked at.
And Asian students.
Interestingly, they were the least likely group to be in schools with those big, like 10% or more spending differences compared to white students. But what's really worrying is that the researchers flagged 16 districts where this very regressive spending seems to be a persistent problem, hitting multiple demographic groups hard. It suggests it's not just a fluke.
This gets us to a really fundamental question, doesn't it? Does money actually matter in education? You hear arguments sometimes that it's more about, I don't know, parent involvement or school leadership.
Well, look, those things are definitely important, no question. But the research on this goes way back, and it's pretty clear. When more money is actually spent on education, especially for low-income students, you see improvements. Achievement goes up, graduation rates go up, and crucially, it impacts their life outcomes later on, things like employment, wages. Investing in high-quality teachers, especially, seems to give the biggest bang for the buck.
That makes sense.
There was this study in North Carolina that tried to calculate the cost of true educational opportunity. They estimated it would take something like $23,600 to $28,000 per student.
Per student, wow.
Yeah, which is more than double what the state was spending at the time. It just highlights the sheer scale of investment that might be needed to really provide all the supports and services, especially for the most vulnerable kids.
That really puts it in perspective. It's not just about the total dollars, but how they're used and where they go.
Yeah.
So what are some other things driving these inequities, maybe beyond just the per-pupil spending figures?
Yeah, there are several factors. Teacher salaries are a big one. Schools in more privileged areas tend to attract and retain more experienced, maybe more qualified teachers. That drives up their spending, sure, but it also often reflects better working conditions.
It's a cycle, kind of.
Sort of, yeah.
I agree.
Then there are differences in what courses are even offered. Access to things like advanced placement or IB classes, which can really set kids up for college success, isn't always equal.
And parent fundraising. I have to admit, I was a bit surprised to see that listed as a driver of inequity. It sounds so positive on the surface. Can you unpack that?
It does sound positive, right? But PTAs and similar groups raise a huge amount of money, something like $425 million a year nationally.
Well,
And while the intention is absolutely good, the effect can be to widen the gap. Schools in wealthier areas can raise vastly more money for extra supplies, technology, even hiring additional staff sometimes.
creating two very different realities within the public system.
Exactly. Lloyd Lindley Jr. talks about this as the zip code effect. He gave this example of an elementary school just 3 miles from his own, where the PTA raised over $100,000 a year. Meanwhile, his school struggled with basic things like working air conditioning.
That's stark. He said something like the system is working exactly the way it was built to, right?
Yeah, a really provocative statement, but it highlights how these structures can perpetuate disparities.
What about the people, the staff,
Mm-hmm.
beyond just teacher experience levels?
Well, schools with mostly Black and Hispanic students tend to have more teachers who are just starting their careers, about 7% more across boundaries, but it jumps to like 47% more in majority Black schools versus majority white schools right next door on the same side of a boundary line.
47% more early career teachers. That's huge.
It is. And another interesting, maybe concerning finding: schools on the majority Black or Hispanic side of those boundaries have about 17% more security guards.
With more security.
Yeah. Which, can feel more like surveillance than support, especially when you compare it to access to school counselors. Counselors are often less common in those schools, or the numbers might look even, but it hides a difference because kids in wealthier schools might have access to private therapy outside school hours.
So it's a difference in the kind of support provided. Surveillance versus mental health resources.
That's a good way to put it. It points to a different approach to student needs, potentially.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about gentrification. This is something we hear about a lot, higher income people moving into lower income areas, changing the neighborhood. It's often controversial, tied to displacement, but sometimes brings new resources too. How does this messy process affect schools?
Yeah, it's really complex when it comes to schools. The neighborhood itself might get more diverse racially or economically, but the schools often lag behind. Sometimes they even lose students, not gain them. It's definitely not a simple equation of, new residents equals instantly better or more integrated schools.
And school choice plays into this too, doesn't it? It seems almost backward that more choice could actually lead to more segregation sometimes.
It absolutely can. What often happens is that families moving into gentrifying areas choose not to send their kids to the local neighborhood public school. They might opt for private schools, or very commonly charter schools or other schools of choice.
Hmm.
And in places like California, which has a big charter school sector, the data shows charters are often more segregated than the traditional public schools. In LA, for example, something like 1 in 5 charters are majority white compared to only 1 in 20 regular public schools. Charters in those gentrifying parts of LA also tend to have fewer low income students. So the bottom line is if you have school choice policies without specific goals for diversity, they often end up increasing segregation. More privileged parents can kind of hoard opportunities in schools with fewer challenges.
That's fascinating. So how did this actually play out in California? The research looked at LA, Oakland, and San Diego between 2000 and 2019, right? What were the key differences?
Yeah, it's interesting to compare. So, across California, nearly half of the low income neighborhoods saw some gentrification during that time. In Los Angeles, overall exposure to low income students went down for all racial groups in those gentrifying areas. But Hispanic elementary students stayed really segregated. The average Hispanic kid was in a school that was over 80% Hispanic in 2019. Black students saw less isolation, but partly because Black enrollment was declining and Hispanic enrollment was growing. But crucially, economically disadvantaged students stayed highly segregated.
So some shifts, but deep segregation remained, especially by income. What about Oakland? I know it's seen huge changes.
Oakland's story is a bit different, maybe slightly more hopeful in some ways. Racial isolation actually went down for all groups in gentrified areas there. The number of majority Black and Hispanic elementary schools dropped significantly from 78% down to 58% in those changing neighborhoods.
That's a big drop.
It is. And those intensely segregated schools, the ones that were 90, 100% Black and Hispanic, in gentrifying areas, they went from nearly 40% down to zero. So still challenges, but definitely more movement toward diversity compared to LA.
Interesting. And San Diego.
San Diego was somewhere in between, maybe. Hispanic student isolation was a bit lower in gentrifying areas than non-gentrifying ones. Black students also became less isolated, but, and this is a really key point, that echoes LA economically disadvantaged students became more isolated across the whole city, including in the gentrifying areas.
So gentrification might bring some racial mixing, but it doesn't automatically fix and can even worsen economic segregation in schools.
Exactly. It really highlights how complex these forces are, and it leads to this concern about pass-through diversity, the idea that a neighborhood might become diverse for a while during gentrification, but then eventually resegregate, perhaps along different lines.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. We've seen the scale of the problem, its history, the complexities like gentrification. The big question is, what can we actually do about it? Let's pivot to solutions. What are some of the policy debates happening, say, at the federal level? What are groups like the Education Civil Rights Alliance worried about?
Right. So the Education Civil Rights Alliance, ECRA, they've put out recommendations raising some serious flags about certain federal funding ideas, specifically things like block grants and school vouchers. Their concern with block grants is that they could get rid of automatic funding increases when student numbers go up, and crucially, they might remove the non-discrimination rules tied to current funding programs.
Okay, and vouchers, that's always a hot topic.
Yeah.
Strong opinions on both sides. What are the main concerns from the sources we looked at?
Well, the ECRA letter argues pretty strongly that vouchers basically divert needed money from public schools to private ones. They also point out that the voucher amount often doesn't cover the full private school tuition.
Creating a false choice, they called it.
Yeah, exactly. For low-income families or families of color who maybe can't afford the difference or the transportation or other costs, it's not a real choice. And a major worry is that private schools taking vouchers often don't have to follow the same federal non-discrimination rules as public schools.
Meaning they could potentially turn away certain students.
Potentially, yes. Students with disabilities, maybe families with LGBTQ parents, or based on religion, depending on the school and the state rules. The research they cite also suggests voucher programs have sometimes been linked to higher dropout rates and maybe lower quality education for Black students and other students of color.
You know, that Reddit thread from Ohio I mentioned really seemed to capture a piece of this. Someone was explaining that state law there apparently requires districts to provide busing for private school students first, before ensuring public school kids in the same district get a ride.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so you had situations where public school kids were taking city buses, dealing with safety issues maybe, while public funds were prioritized for transporting private school students. Critics argued it mainly benefits wealthier families who could already afford private school anyway.
That's a really vivid example of how these policies can play out on the ground and who benefits. It shows why people are concerned about resource diversion. So, to push back against these kinds of inequities, the sources suggest several things states can do. First off, transparency. State education departments need to collect and release really clear, easy to understand data on school level spending, broken down by where the money came from.
Makes sense. Knowledge is power. What else?
State leaders, like governors, should be ready to veto voucher bills and really explain to the public how they can drain resources from public schools. Legislators should, ideally, reject proposals to start or expand voucher programs. And if a state does have voucher programs already, they absolutely need to make sure those programs include strong non-discrimination rules, similar to federal civil rights law.
Protect the students using them.
Exactly. States also need to beef up their own funding formulas, especially for vulnerable student groups, and strengthen protections for students with disabilities under laws like IDEA and Section 504.
And it's not just about academics or funding formulas, is it? What about the whole child, mental health, things like that?
Absolutely crucial. The recommendations also stress seeking funding specifically for the extra needs of students dealing with trauma or mental health challenges. It's recognizing that you can't learn effectively if those fundamental needs aren't being met.
It keeps coming back to this idea that these inequities aren't accidents, they're results of policy choices. So if we want to get at the root causes, we probably need to look beyond just school policy, right? Like housing.
Precisely. You have to look upstream. Housing policies are critical. Things like inclusionary zoning, which encourages or requires developers to include affordable units in new projects, or community preference policies, which give current residents a better shot at getting into new subsidized housing, helping prevent displacement, and strong tenant protections against harassment and eviction. These are all connected to school equity because they influence who lives where and therefore who goes to which school.
And then there's integrating the schools themselves. That sounds like a huge challenge. What kind of approaches are actually working?
It's definitely a challenge, but there are models. Some districts use controlled choice plans. Places like New York City, Berkeley, Cambridge have tried this. They use algorithms that factor in parent preferences, but also aim for specific demographic balances. Dallas has tried 50-50 schools using weighted lotteries to try and get a good socioeconomic mix. But beyond just the admissions policies, it's also about making the local public schools genuinely appealing to all families. That means things like maybe offering full day care, high-quality extracurriculars, special magnet programs, free public preschool, strong leadership, community partnerships. Really investing in the school itself.
And once you start getting more diversity in a school, you have to make sure it's actually inclusive,
Right.
not just diverse on paper.
That is such a key point. You need to actively work to prevent, gentrifying families from consciously or unconsciously creating separate tracks or excluding families of color. That means tackling things like disproportionate discipline rates or how kids get tracked into gifted or special ed programs. It means using teaching methods that respect and build on students' diverse backgrounds, culturally sustaining pedagogy.
And training for staff, too, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Professional development for principals and teachers on how to actually manage and facilitate positive racial integration is vital. And finally, encouraging collaboration between housing folks and education folks, maybe through state or federal grants, so they can plan together for these demographic shifts.
Okay, so moving beyond those traditional government funding streams, we're also seeing some really different, maybe more innovative ways to fund education pop up. What are some of these alternative models the sources talked about?
Yeah. Besides the usual government money, tuition, and donations, schools and education initiatives are exploring things like crowdfunding, social impact investing, and public-private partnerships, or PPPs. It's about diversifying where the money comes from.
Let's take crowdfunding first. Most of us have probably seen GoFundMe pages. How does this work in education? Are there different types?
Yeah, it's basically using online platforms to get donations from a lot of people. It can be reward-based, like you donate to get some ed tech gadget developed, or equity-based, where you invest in an educational startup. There's straightforward donation-based, maybe for scholarships, and even lending-based for student loans or building projects. It taps into a much wider pool than, say, a school bake sale.
And it can actually raise significant money, right? Not just small amounts.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention UC Berkeley raising over $100,000 for student research pretty quickly, and Harvard Business School pulling in over $1 million for an entrepreneurship program through crowdfunding. So it can definitely bring in real capital.
That's pretty impressive. Okay, what about social impact investing? That sounds intriguing, blending financial return with doing good.
It is fascinating. It's about attracting investors who aren't just looking for profit, but also want their money to create positive social change, like improving education. The key ideas are, one, you have to be intentional about the impact you want to make. Two, you have to be able to measure that impact, show that it's actually working. And three, there's still an expectation of some financial return for the investor, even if it's maybe lower than pure commercial investing.
And are there examples of this working in education?
Yes, definitely. There was something called the Educate Girls Development Impact Bond in India that apparently improved enrollment and learning for girls. And in the US, social finance has used career impact bonds to fund job training programs, so it connects education to workforce outcomes too.
Interesting. And the last one was public-private partnerships, PPPs.
hmm
How do those fit into the education picture?
PPPs are basically collaborations between a government entity, like a school district, and a private company or organization. The goal is usually to gain efficiency, maybe improve quality, or expand access to something. They can look like service contracts, maybe a company provides teacher training, or management contracts where a private group runs a school, or even concessions where they operate a whole program for a set time.
Any well-known examples?
IBM's P-Tech program is often cited. It partners with schools to give kids tech skills and work experience. And Pearson, the big education company, worked with the UN on a program called Bridge to Education in developing countries. Of course, PPPs aren't simple. They can be complex to set up. You have to figure out who takes which risks, and you need really strong agreements and oversight to make sure the public interest is still the top priority.
Wow, okay. We have really covered a massive amount of ground today. We've dug into this incredibly complex world of school funding, resource equity. We looked at those shocking gaps inside districts, not just between them.
Yeah, and how gentrification throws another layer of complexity on top of everything.
Right. And then we explored some potential solutions, from policy changes to these newer alternative funding ideas. You've heard how things like history, policy choices, even just local property taxes can fundamentally shape a kid's education.
And I think a key takeaway, connecting back to that idea of equity, is that it's not just about equal money, but equitable money, making sure those with greater needs actually get more resources. And what really stands out from the sources is this constant refrain. These funding inequities, they aren't random. They're the result of policy choices that have been made over time. They're not inevitable.
It really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? So here's a final thought for you, our listener. If these disparities really are a matter of choice, what specific policy changes right there in your own community do you think could help unlock a more equitable future for all the students? And maybe more importantly, what would it actually take to make those changes happen?